Hi, Misha here, and if you couldn't tell, it's a rainy day / evening. So with that, let's move on to the third part in the video about space stations. Why not? Yes. Anyway, we're going to cover the International Space Station, or at least Phase 2 of the agreement between the US and Russia, NASA and Roscosmos. And for that, we have a model, toy, what have you, from Action Products Space Voyagers that was released in 2001-2002 to commemorate Expedition 1, EO1. And this is the first phase of the station and its multiple components. In the next video, we will get to Phase 3 and to kind of update to where the station is today. But unfortunately, this is the only release they had. I think if things had gone differently, they might have updated this or expanded it or even made additional sets, because you'll see it's kind of a Lego style where you could add to it. But I believe the Columbia disaster in February of 2003 put pay to a lot of stuff like that. So sad, but these are really neat for what they were. And much like with Mir, beggars cannot be choosers when it comes to space station models, toys, figures, what have you. We get what we get, sadly. So with that, where we left off last time, 1998, the end of Shuttle Mir. And in that video, we did talk a little bit about how the American Freedom Station plans and the Russian Mir 2 station plans really never died. They just started to merge in 1993 to form the ISS. The International Space Station is the largest thing ever assembled in orbit, and by some accounts the most expensive thing humanity has ever done, and probably the biggest joint project between nations ever done, although sadly did not involve China for reasons. Today, it's quite large. If you include the truss, over 100 meters on that side, so over a football pitch. The pressurized modules, which there are 16 of, are nearly 75 meters end to end. You have 8 from America, 6 from Russia, and then you have 1 each from Japan and Europe. Plus there are unpressurized modules and other external science things. You have a total of 8 major solar arrays with some minor ones, various docking ports. You have a pressurized volume of roughly 1,000 cubic meters, although not all of that's, strictly speaking, habitable. And it is about 410,000 kilograms in weight, and today supports a standard crew of 7. Quite impressive, and its time is coming to an end. It's actually been extended. There were various times when it was expected to end much earlier, but these days it looks like the final days will be around 2030. But it all began here with this one single module, Zarya, which was built in Russia but funded by the USA, part of NASA's budget, and was created in the mid-90s and launched in 1998. Also known as the Functional Cargo Block, or FGB, this would be the first component to launch. And ironically, it's actually storage. And not so ironically, in a lot of ways, it's leftover Soviet hardware, because this all kind of goes back to previous space station efforts and attempts by both Russia and America, and even Japan and Europe. So we all begin right here, very humble beginnings. And I recall that a lot of science fiction writers in the early 2000s were very skeptical that the International Space Station would actually ever come to fruition. And in 2003, after the Columbia disaster, it looked like they very well could be right, because without the shuttle, this would not get built. It took 40 assembly flights to do the station, but 36 of them were from the shuttle. The others were from Soyuz and, Proton rockets and Soyuz rockets, and a few from the Falcon heavy lift rocket from SpaceX. But yeah, the shuttle literally did the bulk of the lifting. So if we're going to talk about the International Space Station, we have to talk about how it came to be. And that involves Mir 2 and the Freedom Station. And this is where the video turns into a black box. But not for very long, I promise. And I think it would be really cool if I could put up pictures here. You want to do it for me? For free? No? Didn't think so. I wouldn't either. There you go. But you can always Google it up. So we're going to talk about Mir 2 for just a minute. And I did mention this in the Mir video, but it's worth reiterating because it's very important to the development of the International Space Station. Now, the concept of Mir 2 in some scope dates back all the way to 1976, the same time what would become Mir was founded. In fact, funding for the cores of those came at the same time. But they really didn't know what they wanted to do for the first decade. There was a whole stuff going back and forth. The Russian shuttle program, Buran, was in and out of the spotlight and would have been critical in constructing Mir and Mir 2. The Buran system was underway and doing well, and even had a very successful, for the most part, automated test flight in 1988. And there were plans for a manned orbital version, but it never came to fruition. In fact, it was nominally canceled by 1991 and officially canceled by 1993 on paper. But everyone knew that it was kind of hopeless with the budget that Roscosmos would have after the fall of the USSR, and even in the late days of the USSR. But Mir, which had kind of taken a back seat to the Buran program, actually was proved quite successful. And even though it was constructed a little slower than had been hoped, and even though there was that stopgap where they only had 2 out of the 4 expansion modules going by 1991, it was more or less a success and quite the feather in Russia's cap. They had constructed the first orbital assembled space station, the first truly modular space station. Before that, Skylab, which there's only the one of from America, and the Salyut stations, which there have been a total of 7 numbered ones, although it gets a little confusing, had all been basically just single modular stations. Okay, so Mir works. So by 1987, 1988, they're drawing up plans for Mir 2. And they were very ambitious. In fact, they projected it to be up to 450,000 kilograms. That's even more than the ISS today. They had projected to have individual modules up to 90 tons. Yeah. They were going to use a truss structure to mount solar panels, radiators, that kind of thing on. And to be fair, this lattice work, this girder system, was kind of borrowed from American concepts. Would have been really cool if they were able to do it, but already by 1990, they're scaling it back. Even before the end of the USSR, they realized it's too ambitious. And in fact, by 91, they're doing what they call Mir 1.5. And this was an idea to kind of piggyback the new station off the old, but it didn't last long because with the ending of the shuttle program in Russia, they had no way to logistically support it. So at the end of 1992, the idea of Mir 2 returns, but it was much smaller in scope. They were going to use the same base core module known as DOS 8, which was almost an exact clone of DOS 7, the core of Mir. And they would connect it with 4 extension modules, which were the 37K
which were 3 to 4 ton modules. So they were actually smaller than the TKS-derived expansion modules that Mir 1 had, except for the Cavant 1, which was a 37K style. So that was the idea. Let's launch the core and then have 2 science labs and then 2 basically docking port extensions. And this would have become Mir 2, and they were hoping to have this completed by the year 2000. You know, start lifting in 94 and go from there. But funding for that and the logistics to support it were dwindling. And talks with America were opening up. Already by the middle of 1992, the Bush administration was talking with the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, and cooperation in space was agreed upon. And this would lead to Russia disclosing the Mir 2 program in the middle of 1993. And from there, by the end of the year, everything started to come together. The U.S. had its own plans, which were grossly expensive. And the Japanese Space Agency and the European Space Agency had hoped to partner with America. Well, now they kind of get involved too. And so this is the earliest concept of what will become the ISS. And with that, we can return to our first module. Zarya, meaning really first light, or the light right before the full dawn, sunrise if you prefer, was really the first component and certainly the first to go into orbit. In 1994, competitions would be held for this piece, and the major competitor from the USA would be from the Boeing company, known as Bus 1. And in the end, really, NASA went with the Russian proposal based on the TKS modular system that had been used with Mir, because it was less than half the cost and gave the same basic functionality. And this would be funded by America but built in Russia. And even though it was technically all new hardware, it was really built with a lot of leftover components from the olden days, and you know, that was criticized by some, but hey, if it works, in my opinion. So at the end of 1994, construction began, and they would be doing fitting out and everything for the next couple of years. By the beginning of 1998, it was entering the testing and evaluation phase on the ground, and then by that fall, it was ready for launch, and it was designated as the 1AR component, and it was put into orbit with a Russian Proton rocket on November 20th, 1998. And what this did, it was basically an early navigation and propulsion component. In fact, it was designed to operate completely alone for 6 or 8 months. And then afterwards, it was meant to be essentially a storage locker, a giant storage locker, which it would take on that role after a couple of years. Since it is derived from the TKS, its specs are very similar. It's about 12.5 meters long, just over 4 meters wide. It does have 2 solar arrays, which were fully expanded, or about 24.5 meters. In addition to that, for power, it had 6 nickel-cadmium batteries. And at launch, it was about 19.5 tons, but when fully fueled and equipped, it was nearly 25 tons. And it had 2 made engines, and it had a total of 36 thrusters. It had over 6 tons of fuel it could carry to power those. And its pressurized space was over 70 cubic meters, but actually its habitable space wasn't much over 21 cubic meters, because essentially there was just a corridor. Most of the inside was taken up by storage lockers, pantries and bins and shelves, and of course equipment racks. So basically you just went in and there was a passageway. In the rear you had 1 docking port, and in the front you had 2, one in the front and one on the what would be nadir, the Earth side. There was actually meant to be a zenith port as well, and I don't know why, but they never installed it and they never used it, and eventually they actually welded it over. So, there you go. And the front and rear would be used for docking other components of the space station, and the nadir port would actually be used for docking Soyuz and Progress craft. So in the very beginning, this would be responsible for navigation and propulsion and boosting the station, kind of carrying out stuff. But that was not its fully intended, use. So the first component, at least by a few days, was from Russia. And again, since even though it was newly made, it definitely derived from Soviet Union technology, and for the most part. But this is an international station, so we have to have an international part. And of course, that gets us to the USA, and where the US had been when it came to orbital stations. All right, back to Black Box. And the US space station concept, it actually dates back even a little further than Mir 2 in some ways, back to the very, very early 70s, right after the U.S. has successfully launched a couple missions to the moon. What's next? Well, there were 3 proposals on the table. A mission to Mars, quite obvious. A space station to be assembled and permanently crewed in orbit. And a reusable space plane with the ability to deliver cargo and do assembly missions, which would become the space shuttle. Well, in 72, right as we're getting to the final Apollo mission to the moon, Nixon tells NASA they can have 1 out of the 3. So pick one, that's what we're going to go with. And so that would end up being the space shuttle, maybe the least and also most ambitious of all the 3 programs. And it gets approved by Congress and it goes through. So that would be what was going forward there. So the only thing that would end up happening space station wise for the US would be Skylab. It's one and only station used with Apollo hardware and a few other things. So Russia was undeniably the better equipped folks when it came to space stations. The Salyut stations gave them a lot of experience. Mir gave them on-orbit construction experience, therefore. But the U.S. wasn't to be denied. After the successful launch of the shuttle Columbia in 81, NASA again starts proposing a modular, permanently inhabited space station in orbit. And this seems naturally logical to them. The arms race, the international thing, the Cold War thing is heating up a little bit from détente early on. And they say, well, we've got the shuttle now. We need to give it a mission. Flights to making a space station would be good. Well, Reagan gets a hold of this and decides to coin it as Space Station Freedom and publicly announces it in 1984. And it was also a very ambitious project in orbit. It was supposed to be nearly 900 cubic meters in habitable space. It was to be something supported with a crew of 4 and to have a Truss system and to be supported by half a dozen shuttle flights a year. There were all kinds of concept proposals. In fact, the earliest one was known as the Power Tower, which is hilarious. But it would go through 7 major revisions throughout the 80s and early 90s. Each time was to essentially scale the budget back. It was already very quickly proving to be over budget, overweight, and frankly underpowered. It just it just really wasn't coming together. And that was even with international partners, including funding. You had Japan, Europe, and Canada coming in to build modules and provide logistics. But already by 88, 89, it scaled back. Congress kept saying, make it cheaper, make it cheaper. And this was understandable because it was projected to cost over $15 billion. And that's in like 1987, 1988 bucks. Huge investment. So we go forward from there. And of course, the Cold War ends. And that kind of urgency goes away. They're still hoping to do it. In fact, NASA has a proposal in 1991. They scale it back and they make this thing. Originally, it was known as the Space Station Freedom, and it was supposed to be done by 1994. Well, this is when the name Space Station Alpha comes into use. And they push it back to starting construction in 95, first habitation of it in 97, have it completed by 98 or so. And it keeps getting scaled back and back and back. But, not a single thing happens. Well, then in 1993, as I mentioned earlier, Russia briefs the USA on the Mir 2 program. And, well, cooperation seems to be the natural course of things. Shuttle Mir is about to kick off. And this would help the budget quite a bit. And they're not going to leave Japan and Europe and Canada out either. So now we have 5 major international partners and several other partners coming on board. And this actually does bring the budget down. And it's officially approved in 1995. Originally it's known as Space Station Alpha, or the International Space Station Alpha, ISSA. But in 95 the name Alpha is removed, although not permanently. It'll actually return for a bit later on. And, construction and funding go from there, even though it is scaled back a bit. For example, originally the U.S. section alone was meant to house 6 astronauts. This would be backed off to 3, and then later increased to 4, which gets us our total of 7 to this day. The Russian section was always meant to be 3. But finally, at last, after many slashes and budget cuts, it's becoming a thing. It's becoming a reality. And it's thanks to international cooperation, as you would imagine. So now we can talk about the U.S. section. Now, keep in mind, NASA had actually started contract work in 1988, and even they had moved on not just past the design concept phase, but actually hardware fabrication of different elements. And despite this, over a decade of working with it, they had managed to use up about $11 billion. So that's not good. Of course, we're in $1990 at this point. But the good news is, this was actually able to be reused for the ISS. It's estimated that NASA had either built or was in the process of being built about 10% of Space Station Freedom / Alpha. And of that 10% that was already being built or already built, they were able to reuse nearly 3/4, even 80% of it. So at least not a whole lot of work went to waste. So that's good. And that actually gets to the first American section of the station.
This would be the first American component to the station, and it would be built with some hardware and technology and concepts from the whole Freedom Station. The module known as Unity, or Node 1. It was the connector, as the name would suggest. It had 6 of these common berthing mechanisms, CBMs, which were designed to work with international modules and to be much larger than previous, so that things could be taken in and out and more just comfortable. But it wasn't just for that. It had communications gear, a lot of electrical connections, fluid pipes, computers, navigation, things like that on board. Very much a small but computerized module. And it is not very large. It's about 5.5 meters by 4.3 meters. Pressurized volumes around 34 cubic meters, but habitable volume, depending on what's inside, is around 20 to 25. And it was the first component to use the kind of universal rack system that we'll see used on the station throughout. So this was one of the components that benefited from the whole Freedom or Alpha station, and it would actually launch into orbit with another. The PMA, or rather 2 of them, one forward, one aft. The pressurized mating adapter is actually what would connect the
CBM port to the APAS-95, the androgynous port. Not only used by Russian systems, but also the space shuttle. And this, of course, has its roots all the way back in the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975 and would be used as the APAS-89 system on Mir and then updated here for the cooperation. And this whole mating port adapter, which is pressurized and heated and has connections for computers and all that inside, so it's not just a tube, it actually has more going on, would be developed from systems that had been on Space Station Freedom and Alpha. Not exactly the same, but it benefited from the technology. Now, the main Unity module would be built by Boeing and would be made of aluminum alloy with stainless steel and other alloys where necessary. And it would weigh over 11 tons. And each of these PMAs would be just under a ton each. And they'd each be just about 2 meters, a little less, tip to tip. And so they would all comfortably fit in the shuttle cargo bay. And on December 4, 1998, this would be loaded onto Endeavour and launched into orbit. And then on December 6th, it would actually go up to orbit and meet the Zarya module. And what the shuttle would do, just as it had done with Mir, it would actually dock this to its own port and then come up and connect the two, so it actually connected directly to the shuttle. And finally, the Russian component and the US component would join together. It would actually take a couple of spacewalks between December 7 and December 9 to do so, connecting cables and power leads and all that. But it would be done. And on December 10, the crew from Endeavour, including one cosmonaut, who we will actually run into again later in the video, they would jointly enter Unity, passing through shortly thereafter into Zarya. They would check systems, unpack things, and go from there. At this point, the young station is not all that large, under 23 meters tip to tip, including the berthing mechanisms here. And it weighs roughly 35 tons with all the propellant and whatnot on Zarya. And of course, at this point, to power it, we just have the 2 solar arrays plus the batteries on Zarya. And Endeavour would be docked to this forward PMA. And of course, when they would leave on December 13, they would just undock from it and then leaving this attached. So we have that front port, we have the nadir port of Zarya, and we have the rear port on Zarya, so a total of 3. And it would be left alone as 1998 rolls over to 1999. Shuttle Discovery would again come in 1999, May 29th, it would dock, and it would actually be the first shuttle to come up and dock to the PMA itself. And it would deliver more supplies, water, stuff for an upcoming mission. But for the next year or so, this would pretty much be where things were at, because there had been a few delays on the ground in Russia and otherwise. But in the year 2000, we would kind of get back on track. So this was the genesis of the International Space Station. Pretty much a far cry from what we know today. So this was the space station as we moved into 1999. And it was planned for that the 3rd module, overall, and the 2nd Russian module, would be added later on that year. But things were delaying in Russia. 1998 was a major recession, if not outright depression, in that nation. 99 wasn't a lot better, and work was behind schedule. And NASA was worried. In fact, they even designed a contingency. just in case Russians weren't able to keep up their end of things. But luckily, they were, even if it were delayed by a year. We come to the module I actually used in the Mir video, Zvezda, meaning star. And this would launch in July. Now, I should mention, on May 19 of that year, the shuttle mission STS-101 would dock with the station, so the first docking in nearly a full year. And they would conduct studies on the air purity, drop off supplies, just generally check on the station and make sure it was ready. Because Russia finally was. Now, what kind of worried NASA, when it came to the FGB, Zarya, there was a contingency. There was a backup unit. But there was not for Zvezda. So if the launch went haywire, or something broke or went wrong, they didn't know what to do. And yeah, this should look like a very familiar module, because it is. This is what originally was known as DOS 8. And funding for this actually does date back to 1976, when it was created as the backup for DOS 7, which would become the core module of Mir. Actual construction work would date back to 1985, with kind of a final fitting out of big hardware by the end of 1986. But by that point, Mir was looking like it was going to be a success, so this would not be needed. Therefore, it was reworked and revamped into the core of Mir 2, which itself didn't happen. So again, it was revamped and refurbished for the International Space Station in the 1990s. Waste not, want not, guys. And I'm there for it. I think that's a great idea. So finally, in 2000, it was ready to go. This is also the one that, rather famously, Pizza Hut paid roughly $1 million to have their logo on the side of the Proton K rocket that launched this, unmanned, of course, into orbit. That would have been on July 12, 2000. It would actually orbit for a couple of weeks, checking out systems. And then it would be docked to the station on July 26th. Again, they only had one shot at this, so they couldn't risk a docking failure, so better safe than sorry. But it would dock successfully to the rear port of Zarya. So at this point, we really have a stack going on here. And this really will increase the functional ability of the station, because really, Zarya and Unity, while they function well as operation centers, navigation, all that, central storage area, they didn't have any provisions for the crew. Well, since Zvezda was based on DOS 8 and the Mir system, it did. In fact, that was kind of its main deal. It's also our largest single module at over 13 meters long and 4.2 meters wide. And it weighed over 20 tons at launch. And that would be boosted up to 24.5 when fully equipped, loaded, supplied up. Now, Zarya did have propulsion, but once Zvezda was docked, that would become basically blocked off. Zvezda had 2 main thrusters and several secondaries. And while it did have 4 fuel tanks, it actually relied on the 6 tanks on Zarya, so they were disconnected. So even the engines here, while the thrusters themselves were no longer in use, the tanks are very important. In fact, the tanks on Zvezda were pretty small, so this held over 6 tons. This was under a ton of fuel, but taken together, it gave 7 tons of fuel to keep everything going, because the stations need boosting and course correction and all that good stuff. And part of that would be an unpressurized compartment at the rear here that kind of surrounds this. But inside, just like with Mir, we would have a lot of living and working space. You'd have the front transfer compartment. It obviously has a port in the front It has a nadir port, and it has a zenith port, unlike Zarya. And then in the rear, we have a transfer port in the back, which was going to be one of the primary docking points for spacecraft, at least of Russian origin. We have 2 more solar arrays. These actually stretch out quite a bit further, nearly 30 meters versus about 24.5 on Zarya. Although, because of the design, internal space isn't as much as you would think. And of course, they would rotate both of them to catch the sun as needed. And like on Mir, the front section past the transfer compartment would be the command center, computers to operate the system and all that. Then you go further back and there's a couple of crew quarters, the little kind of phone booth looking things. There would be exercise devices, a bike, a treadmill. There would be a small kitchen area, a refrigerator, even a small freezer, a hydration station. There would be a little table. There would be the electron system, which actually used the air and wastewater to generate oxygen. It would also condense water out of the air in an emergency to be used. There would be additional storage racks and everything, but most of that would be on Zarya. And maybe more importantly, it had a total of 14 windows for observation and science and all that. And it did have a small greenhouse known as the Ladda, and a few other small sciencey bits. It wasn't primarily intended for science research, but it had some basics there. Again, very, very similar to what we saw in Mir, just a little bit updated in the 90s for newer stuff. But really, even Unity had a little more space. Speaking of, this had about 75 cubic meters of pressurized space, of which nearly 50 was technically speaking habitable. So that means that really it about doubled the habitable space and greatly increased the overall pressurized space than the station had before. So we're really getting somewhere. And on August 8th, 2000, the station would have another first. The first unmanned, robotic-controlled cargo ship would dock. Progress M13. Now this is not Progress, this is actually a Soyuz, but as you know, externally they're very, very similar, just a little bit different back here in the transfer compartment. But yeah, it would come up and dock to the rear port of Zvezda, containing, well, cargo, supplies, and also just testing everything out for the first time. Yep, further adding to the stack. And then the other end would receive a visitor on September 11, when STS-106 would dock. And they would conduct an EVA or two to connect cables and other things, finalizing Zvezda's connection to the rest of the structure. And they would unload cargo and everything. On September 12, both the astronaut and cosmonaut would enter the expanded station. And this is Peanut. She has been far too long without being acknowledged. And yeah, the mission would stay docked, kind of just prepping everything, unpacking more food, water, clothing, even things like office supplies, a ham radio, just getting things ready. Because the station is almost to the point where it's ready for its first crew, for its first habitation. They would also unload the Progressive crew, of course. So, after a slight delay, things are looking up for the ISS. Or, as it would soon be known, Alpha. Small correction. I said Progress M13. This is actually Progress M1-3. Sorry, text-to-speech strikes again. But this would remain docked throughout the duration of the shuttle mission, and then be undocked and deorbited on October 1st after it had been, had the supplies removed by the shuttle crew and transferred fuel to the fuel tanks. And it was making way for the next shuttle mission. STS-92 would dock on October 13 to the forward PMA-2 on the Unity module. They would deliver final supplies and equipment in preparation for the first expedition, and a couple of smaller external modules, including the third and final PMA-3, which would be on the nadir side, for now anyway. And all three of these would be identical to each other, although PMA-1, since it was decided to be permanently connected to Zarya, would have additional computers and stuff to help with control systems, and it would never move. But PMA-2 and 3, yeah, they'd move around over time. And that was just to give expansion and whatnot. And this is where the station would sit when EO1 was ready to go on Halloween of 2000. Soyuz TM-31 successfully launched in orbit alone for a couple of days. It was commanded by Yuri Gidzenko, and it had flight engineer Sergei Krikalev, and an American on board, the not really rookie, but the most rookie of the crew, Bill Shepard. And even though he had been on 3 previous space flights and spent 2 weeks in space in total, compared to the Russians, yeah, far less time. They'd both been veterans of Mir, and Krikalev actually was the one who entered into Zarya back in 1998. So he'd actually already been on the ISS, such as it was at the time. On November 2nd, they would rendezvous carefully with the rear of Zvezda and successfully dock on its rear port. Now, interestingly, Gidzenko would be the commander of the mission on Soyuz up to this point, but once they entered the ISS, Bill Shepard would actually take over as a mission commander, known as EO1. Some in Russia weren't sure about this. After all, the 2 cosmonauts had more space experience, but, you know, Shepard was a Navy SEAL in a past life and still had space experience, and frankly, all went well. And the station they docked to would have about 175 cubic meters of pressurized space and roughly 70 meters of habitable space in the beginning, because only really Zvezda and Zarya were useful, because Unity did not have enough power yet. So it wasn't really heated and kept up at this point. And while they had a few science experiments on the mission, that really wasn't the purpose. Even though they were going to be there over 4.5 months, they were mostly there to unpack and install things and do things and check things. And that's what they would pretty much do. The 2 Russians would stay in the cabins on board Zvezda. And you might think that Shepard would, I don't know, be in Zarya. But no, he would actually just hang his bunk, as it were, in a convenient spot in the same module. This was felt best for quick and easy communication, especially in the case of emergency. So all 3 found themselves comfortably habitating this one module, such as it was. And they would have a very busy first couple of weeks. On the 13th, they would actually first use that ham radio that had been delivered by the earlier shuttle mission. They would get all the stuff up and running, of course, running into small problems here and there. And they would be visited by another Progress craft, Progress M14. And that would actually dock to the nadir port on Zarya over here, since the primary port for use on Zvezda was, well, used by TM. There. Progress M14 would dock on November 18, but would actually be undocked on December 1st to make way for the next shuttle mission, which would dock on December 2nd, STS-97. But they would not immediately socialize with the crew. Actually, they would perform spacewalks and installation of another component, which is actually very important to the station. For anyone in the know following at home, going back to STS-92, I skipped something. It did not just deliver the PMA-3. It also delivered the Z1 Truss, which was the first of the truss or girder system, something that had been planned for by the US and also the Russians for years. And it was put on top of Unity. And it actually used the common berthing mechanism, the CBM system, and provided 4 gyroscopes for basically directing the station, kind of like Mir had, so they didn't have to expend fuel. It also had communications antenna, high-speed data relay, so on and so forth. But because Unity didn't have enough power, it was essentially inert. It was a stub. But, they got it up. It was the mission. Now, it would be STS-97 that would finally kind of get this all online. On top of the Z1 Truss, which is on top of Unity, they would stack the P6 Truss. Interestingly, while this piece would remain there for a number of years, it was ultimately meant to be at the far end of the portside truss, hence P6. When they finally get the truss set up, you'd have S0, and then P1, S1, and so on and so forth. But it would actually stay here for quite some time, and the reason it was used is because it could mount the first 2 of the large solar array panels, quite massive, plus it mounted one of the radiator. So it actually contained quite a bit and would ultimately quintuple the power output of the station, which would allow them to turn Unity online along with the systems in the Z1 and really get some power flowing. And because they were doing spacewalks to kind of set everything up, this is why they kept the ISS and the shuttle separate, because of the different pressures, until they were done. But then on December 8, they would stabilize out, open the hatch, and then meet in Unity and socialize. A good bit of surface area on these. They're about 34 meters across each. And the truss and everything itself is nearly 16,000 kilograms. Yeah, this really added a lot of ability to the station. And the nice thing about these external girders, they were a good place to stow stuff and work from. Yeah, they weren't really pressurized. Although the Z1 uniquely did have a small pressurized area down where it connected to Unity. Just a small little dome area that would allow the astronauts to connect cables and cords and data relays, also service them in a shirt sleeve environment without having to, do EVAs. When they weren't using it for that, the small little dome could actually be used as a storage area, and was. So, yeah, the shuttle would be docked and remain there a couple of days. The crew would socialize and prepare for Christmas. And then STS-97 would return home, and the 3 crew on the ISS would prepare for the holidays. They would actually have Christmas off and would spend the time using the new data connection to Earth. When they were just using the Russian systems, their communications with the ground were limited, but now with the American systems, they had much better access to satellites and other 24/7 stuff, plus they had better internet connection and all that. They would even have some gifts that were brought up by either the shuttle or previous Progress missions. Open gifts, talk with family, chill out a bit, watch the Earth, listen to music. Then the next day, Boxing Day for the Brits, Progress M14 would actually redock. It had been kind of free flying in a stationary orbit outside for 3 weeks. It would actually redock, which is one of the benefits of the newer Progress craft. And it would stay there a bit. And then on January 1st, New Year's, Bill Shepard would write a poem in the log from the crew. Rather famous thing. Another rather famous thing, and this was actually agreed upon by all three of the crew. They thought the name International Space Station was a little cold and imprecise and also a mouthful to talk on the radio, so the name Alpha was brought back. Now, some in the Russian Federation, mostly politicians, argued saying that Mir was the first station, therefore yada yada yada. But in the end, the crew were fine with the call sign Alpha, so at least for this first mission, EO1, that would be predominantly what they would use. And again, makes sense for them. And this was the stack, as it were, as we cross from the year 2000 into the year 2001. For what it's worth, this is the direction the station flies. So you have Zvezda in the rear, as it's the propulsion module. Now we have the gyros and the Z1 to help conserve fuel. We have 2 PMAs to dock going forward. And they'll soon be moved around because that's what they were designed for. And that's really where this particular model or toy or set kind of ends, because the next expansion would come with STS-98, a shuttle mission that would come in February of 2001. Originally it was scheduled for January, but they had some issues with the shuttle launch, so they postponed it. And it would finally make her up, and they would connect the Destiny module, the next American one, the laboratory, quite famous, which would kind of be the core of the U.S. section, with Unity Node 1 being the main connecting hub. And then from there, we would actually get Progress M44, the next updated variation in the series. It would arrive in late February, carrying more supplies than the last group of supplies. Interestingly, they would actually relocate Soyuz TM-31 from Zvezda to the nadir port of Zarya, and then M44 would come up and dock there. And that was just generally in preparation, as the mission is finally coming to an end after over 4 months. STS-102 would be the relief mission in March of 2001. They would be bringing the crew of EO2 up, still 3, and bringing the crew of EO1 back to Earth, still 3. We didn't lose anyone. That's good. EO1 was busy, again, unpacking mostly. They did a few science experiments, but mostly just getting things set up. For example, they set up a computer network of various laptops and things, tested systems, got supplies going, tested docking and undocking. And of course, having Unity coming online and the new power kept them more than busy. Just kind of proof of concept of all the systems. So the handover from EO1 to EO2 began on March 14, and officially would conclude when the shuttle hatch would close and the shuttle would officially undock. I believe at this point they're still on a PMA 3 on the bottom there, the nadir. Once that happened, Shepard was no longer commander. EO2 would officially take over, and the next phase would begin. For what it's worth, they would land on March 21st, 2001, after a mission that was 136 days. Quite a success, all in all. And a good gesture of international cooperation. I do wish this set from Space Voyagers did come with Destiny, because it is of the first mission, but at least it did come with the P6 Truss and solar arrays. It's kind of like I said, that first phase of the mission. And to be fair, Destiny came within the last month, not even before they were leaving, so they didn't really do a whole lot with it. And for us, well, we'll deal with that next time too. Because while this is the only set in this series, I figured out another way to display the further building of the ISS with a different set. So we'll do that. It was actually going pretty smoothly up through 2001 and 2002, but then the Columbia disaster would put it at risk. So construction would stop. In fact, 2004, 2005, you basically just have station keeping missions. They would use Soyuz to keep a crew on board, a nominal crew, just to keep things going, and it was really uncertain about its future. But, well, that's a story for another video. And apologies, I'm getting over the flu, if you couldn't tell, which I'm sure you could while recording this, but I wanted to do some work and have some fun, so I hope you enjoyed it too. This is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.